Good evening. Good evening. My name is Marina Stilianu, and I am a student co-supervisor and project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We hereby recognize the prior status and enduring diversity of this land and the many indigenous nations that stand in relation to it. Particularly, the thousands of indigenous children from dozens of tribes forced into the reprogramming camp established at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879. Dickinson College supported this agenda of cultural eradication in both word and deed. Turning honestly toward that shameful past animates this acknowledgement and gives orientation to our desire for a more reconciled future. Accordingly, this living land acknowledgement is intentionally incomplete, a reflection of the ongoing process it represents, to learn respectfully from the stories of this land and the peoples that carry them, to think reflectively about the injustice in our shared past, and to act responsibly with that knowledge today to inspire a more equitable tomorrow. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Departments of English, Educational Studies, Math and Computer Science, and the Law and Policy and Film and Media Studies programs, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, the regulation of AI in the creative economy. Tonight's program was student-initiated. At the beginning of every semester, the Clark Forum's student employees propose ideas for programs and then vote to select 2 programs to develop for the following semester. Last fall, I proposed an event on the intersection between copyright protections and generative artificial intelligence. At the time, the film industry was paralyzed by the SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes, which occurred in part over the use of generative AI. Many of my syllabi also had new stipulations about ChatGPT in their academic integrity sections, so I saw this conversation as a critical one for our campus and our community more broadly. This technology is incredible, exciting, and concerning, and I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to propose bringing a conversation about generative AI to our campus. Learning how this technology affects academia, intellectual property, and the creation of art within our current legal frameworks will help us determine how to work with these advancements and properly adjust our systems to correctly regulate the use of AI programs. Our speaker tonight, Professor Matthew Sagg, is here to discuss the issues that the rise of generative AI poses for copyright law. The way in which generative AI systems are trained to generate information based on previously processed data raises questions about the context of fair use of copyrighted materials. Additionally, the content produced by generative AI programs creates ethical questions about the substitution of human creators of content with artificial intelligence systems. Tonight, Professor Sagg will discuss the new questions regarding key elements of copyright raised by generative AI. Where do the rights of a copyright holder end, and where does the freedom to use copyright works begin? Matthew Sagg is a professor of law in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data science at Emory University School of Law. He is an expert in copyright law and intellectual property, and a leading US authority on the fair use doctrine and its implications for researchers in the field of text data mining, machine learning, and AI. Professor Sagg's research has been published in leading journals such as Nature and Science and the law reviews of the University of California, Berkeley, Georgetown, Northwestern, Notre Dame, Vanderbilt, Iowa, and William & Mary, among others. In July of 2023, Professor Sagg testified to the US Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Intellectual Property in relation to copyright and generative AI. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion, expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. In the event of an emergency, please note that accessible exits are located through the double doors behind you to the right at the end of the hallway. At this time, I ask that you silence all cell phones and electronic devices. And now, please welcome our speaker, Professor Matthew Sag.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm not going to stand behind the podium. I'm so excited to be here. I've already had a fantastic time here in Carlisle. Dickinson College is lovely. Your students are amazing. Your faculty and staff are incredible. I really have had a marvelous time. I'm very excited about this talk tonight. So yeah, let's get started with an introduction. I have a lot of slides. There are not many words. It's mostly pictures. I just want to say at the beginning, all the words are mine. All the pictures are produced on ChatGPT, Midjourney, other such devices. We live in astonishing times. This picture was made by DALL-E 3 in response to a prompt that was written by ChatGPT in response to a prompt that I wrote telling ChatGPT that you are an expert prompt engineer and a skilled graphic artist. This is pretty incredible. And I want you to understand this technology at a fundamental but not overly technical level tonight. And I want to disabuse you of some notions about that this is all just completely impenetrable magic. But I don't want you to lose the astonishment for, wow, we have built some really incredible things here, and we are going to continue to build even more incredible things that will improve the lives of many people. So yeah. The generative AI models that are more or less trained to predict the next word in a sentence can summarize documents. They can elaborate on a series of bullet points. They can carry on what seems like a conversation. They can write essays. They can even pass exams in law, medicine, and accounting. They can create new art and new music. Oh my goodness, I said the same thing twice on one of those slides, which proves that it wasn't written by ChatGPT. The thing about generative AI that I think is such a revolution is that not only can it produce these digital artifacts, but often when we look at them, we don't know for sure whether they were created by a machine or by a person. In those cases, they pass the Turing test. This test of, if you didn't know who the author was, would you know it's a machine? Now, most of these images have like a little AI look to them. I think that's true. But in terms of text, there's a lot of things where you literally cannot tell the difference. But these AI programs can produce these images, movies, video, sound, text, etc., at a speed and scale that is completely beyond ordinary human abilities. This provokes, I think, fear and awe. The machine learning models that these AI systems are built on are data dependent and inscrutable. They are a black box. You cannot look inside GPT-3 and understand what is going on, right? It's all just math within more math. That raises a lot of questions. Questions about privacy, questions about trust and accountability, questions about bias, questions about representation. We are only just beginning to grapple in law with questions such as, who is the author of an image produced by generative AI? Who is responsible for dangerous medical advice given by a chatbot? Or slanderous and defamatory utterances suggested by a chatbot. More broadly, we're starting to think about, well, what is the future of employment? What is the future of education? What is the future of creativity in a world where generative AI can make an image like this really so trivially? Even more fundamentally, some of us are asking, what is our place in the universe as machines begin to take on attributes that look sometimes like human intelligence and that people are telling us will lead to AGI and superhuman intelligence? So I want to talk to you about creativity and generative AI. But first, I think I kind of need to talk to you about what is AI. I'm going to propose a purely functional definition of AI. Artificial intelligence involves a computer system that performs a function that would otherwise require human judgment, human intelligence, and human perception. So when an AI algorithm looks at an X-ray to decide whether or not you have tooth decay, well, that's previously something that would have been done by a dentist using skill, experience, and judgment. When the AI does this, it's not making the same judgments. It's working in a completely different way, but it's getting to the same result. So, excuse me. I've been talking way too much today. AI today is mostly machine learning. There's a whole nother branch of AI involving expert systems, and this is an attempt to build really complicated decision trees, really complicated expert systems that foresee every single contingency and integrate together in a logical fashion. And if you've ever tried to write complete instructions for your dog walker or your house sitter, you will realize the futility of this approach. Machine learning has really taken off. It's actually been around for a while. It's really taken off in the past 10 years or so because our computers have gotten bigger and faster, because we have internet-scale data, and because some very clever people have figured out ways to make the algorithms that actually control how they learn just a little bit smarter, and critically smarter so that they can work in parallel. Because it takes a long time to read 1 trillion words, one word at a time. The important thing to understand about every machine learning system, which basically means every AI system these days, is that the models depend on the data. This has some really important implications, not all of which I'm going to really go into detail on tonight. One of those implications is that it creates a demand for data. That palpably affects our lives. It creates a demand for surveillance, or what some people call surveillance capitalism. It incentivizes businesses not just to give us services, but to extract our data because they learn from the data. Data dependency is also key because AI entails all of the human subjectivity that was in the training data, for good and bad. All of the bias that was in the training data is in the AI, necessarily. Not because math is evil, right? Not because math is biased, but because when you throw a bunch of math at a biased society, you end up with tilted math. AIs are not simple. Right? The process of building a machine learning model is actually still kind of art and science. There are a lot of subjective human decisions made in model design, made in how to treat variables, just things as mundane as how to clean up data. Those are all possible interventions of human subjectivity that you need to take account of when you think of these models. So these models are not beyond us. They're not better than us. They're not true and objective, whereas we are flawed and fallible. these models reflect us in good ways and bad ways. I want to talk now about how AI actually learns. And I'm going to mostly talk about text models and image models because I think they're easier to explain. The basic ingredients are an enormous amount of training data. The GPT models were trained on, honestly, most of the easily available text content on the internet. Right? That's several times larger than the whole Library of Congress. Right? All of that text was scraped from websites, stored in a server, probably somewhere in California. They built a machine learning model with a lot of variables. When I did stats, I thought that 4 variables was a lot of variables. GPT-4 has 1.8 trillion variables, trillion with a T. That is literally incomprehensible, I think, to most of us. Right? So it's a big model. Each variable or parameter is just a small number. Basically, you throw all this data in very small increments at this very big model that you initially set randomly, like stupidly randomly. And you ask the model to do a very simple thing. So GPT, we asked it to predict the next word. We just showed it like a little string of text and said, predict the next word. And then whatever it is in the model, we then look at, the model then looks at the result. Whatever it is in the model that led the model to make a better than average guess, that basically gets upvoted in the next round of training, and the little weights in the model get slightly adjusted. When the model makes a guess that's not good, that's further from the true guess, then whatever led it to that kind of gets downvoted slightly. And so the model incrementally just adjusts the weights on all of those trillions of parameters. But you're just asking it to do a really simple thing. But as it learns to do this simple thing, it is, in many senses, learning. It's not learning the way a human does. You will often hear technology people talk about, oh, our neural networks are modeled on the human brain. It's like, yeah, they are at a rough conceptual level, right? The neurons in this model are so much more simple than the neurons in your brain. You should almost think of the neurons in your brain as one of these models, right? The analogy kind of works, though. It is a lot like learning. It's learning to predict just this kind of dumb thing of what is the next word, given all these other words. What's really fascinating is that prediction, if you have a model that has learned really well in context how to predict the next word, then you have built a model that can create. That model creates in this autoregressive fashion, which kind of just means one word at a time, right? So that is essentially how machine learning works, why machine learning works. You take a lot of data, you take a big model, you get the model to do something simple over and over again, and gradually improve at doing that simple trick until it predicts so well that you can use it to create. Let me give you a tangible example. Right? Who can tell me what the next word is here? And to make it easy, I've given you some options. Miss, at the front, what do you think the next word is? Mm-hmm. Not semicolon? Not banana? Right? So you think it's right. Have you read Anu Bradford's book on digital empires? it's the most amazing magic trick. Somewhere in your brain, although you haven't read this book that literally I cut and paste this from, you understand enough about the English language, enough about the society you live in, to know that the EU has responded by insisting on its sovereign, yeah, semicolon's a terrible guess, umbrella would be weird. Right? Right's looking pretty good. Duty? Duty's not far off. Like, duty's not wildly improbable, but you're correct. It's right. That's how GPT is learning. GPT is learning by being shown a string of text, holding something out, and then becoming good at guessing what the missing word is. So the analogy between human learning and machine learning is, like, it's not far off. The really radical thing is we don't just do this with words now. We do this with images, right? We do this with video. OpenAI has figured out how to reduce a video into basically a set of space-time pixel relationships that it thinks of as tokens. And then once it thinks of it as a token, it's exactly the same process as doing this, which is also all in tokens rather than words. One important thing to understanding this technology is to understand that the training data is enormous. Even though the models are big and they need to be really big to work, they're still small compared to the training data. So if you take a model like Stable Diffusion, which is one of the important image generation models, Stable Diffusion was trained on 100 terabytes of images. Like, it was trained on 2 billion or so images. The model itself, once trained, is 4 gigabytes. A terabyte is like 1,000 gigabytes, so I think that's like 25,000 to 1. The model's too small to memorize, right? If there's one simple thing you need to remember, you just memorize it. But if you need to remember some huge complicated thing, what do? You abstract it. You develop like a mental model that gives you heuristics, that gives you shortcuts, right? That's why, that's how learning works. That's why people with photographic memories are often not the smartest people in the room, because actually the process of consolidating and abstracting is really important for intelligence. So the models are designed to be way too small to memorize. I've really offended someone with a photographic memory here, I'm sure. But their significant others are really excited. The models are designed deliberately to be way smaller than the training data, so they're forced to generalize, right? Let me give you a visual example of how this works. I went into a website that has a pretty accurate read on what the training data is for Stable Diffusion that was used to make this image. This is a coffee cup that is also a portal to another dimension. I looked at all of the images of coffee cups that I could find. Here is a representative sample. The model has learnt something abstract and generalizable about how we portray coffee cups. Like, a coffee cup doesn't need to be white, but they tend to be in images, so it is in Stable Diffusion, right? The liquid in the coffee cup is blackish, brownish, but you'll see that it's kind of abstracted away the Pikachu, the woman with smooth skin, the men with facial hair, the sunsets, the sunrises, the little cakes, etc. The model has kind of shelved all of that to just learn like a more general concept of what a coffee cup is. And that's a sort of good illustration of how these models are supposed to work. The really amazing thing about these models is because they're generalists, because they've been forced to not memorize but to sort of create a more abstract representation, you're not limited to things that are in the training data. Right? There are no photos of astronauts riding ducks on the surface of Mars with a backlit by a spotlight in the training data. There don't need to be. There's plenty of rubber ducks, there's plenty of astronauts, there's plenty of Mars scenes. Right? The model can navigate to a new point that's essentially implied by the training data, but is not in the training data. So we call that the latent space. And it's this ability to navigate to new points in the latent space that aren't actually part of the training data that makes generative AI so generative. It's the reason why you can ask GPT a question that literally no one has ever asked, and it will give you a decent prediction of what a human answering that question would sound like. So now that I've told you how amazing all this is, let me try and disabuse you of how amazing it also isn't. And I think an instructive and socially relevant way to do this is to think about the bias that we still see in AI. So my co-author and I produced a bunch of images using Midjourney and DALL-E 3. We asked these devices to draw a scientist demonstrating a robot in a lab, a musician performing on stage, an architect doing something with a building, a pilot inspecting an airplane, and a chef presenting food. Does anyone see the common theme in the protagonists? It's all white men, right? It's all white men. And this is not because all architects are white men, because all chefs are white men, right? It's because the training data overwhelmingly portrays these roles as white men, and naturally, the model gravitates towards the center of the distribution. Just in the same way as right seemed like a good guess and banana seemed like a terrible guess, the models are guessing, but their guesses kind of converge towards the center, which is a limit. It's one of the reasons why I don't think they're going to replace all human creativity. Because even though you can navigate to a new point in the latent space, you can have an astronaut riding a banana or a rubber duck, right? It's hard to get them to break free of just what's normal in the training data, which is in our society. And most good writing and most good art and most of anything that's good is actually a little bit surprising, isn't just the logical extrapolation of everything that's come before. I should say, it's not always men. If you ask for a house cleaner, yeah, it's mostly women, mostly non-white women. If you ask for a community organizer, suddenly we see people of color. If you ask for a Black Lives Matter protester, interestingly, GPT would not draw a Black Lives Matter protester outside the White House, maybe for good reasons. So for that one, I did a person protesting about criminal justice outside the White House. Midjourney was quite happy to do a Black Lives Matter protester outside the White House. Not all Black Lives Matter protesters are black, but it's a statistically well-informed guess that the average representation of one is. I'm not saying the average one is, I'm saying the average representation, right? And this is a fundamental limit of generative AI. It's a fundamental limit of being data dependent. So you can fix this easily, right? My co-author was looking for an image to end a talk, And so she's like, I'm going to be a blonde woman standing behind a podium. I should have a picture that looks like me. So she told Midjourney to create a speaker standing behind a podium asking questions, was all men. So she was like, no, a blonde female speaker. And Midjourney's like, oh, okay. This is what blonde females look like, and they're being stared at by a bunch of creepy men. That's normal. Or maybe this is what they look like. Yeah, that looks totally professional. Right? The model is kind of trapped in the training data with all of the hang-ups and weirdness of the training data. It's easy to get distracted by the fun you can have with latent space. And so, I had fun with this. This is 9 cyberpunk Supreme Court justices. This is steampunk founding fathers on bicycles. Supreme Court justices as cats, dogs, badgers, and pigs. We like that so much we chose 2. And then a fox wearing a Yankees cap signing the Declaration of Independence. Right? This is amazing. This is so awesome. But beyond the novelty of the kind of unlikely combination, when you think about these images, they're all actually highly conventional representations. Right? And that is something that I think people will begin to transcend through clever prompting strategies, through ways to kind of inject their own human creativity. But the models as like a basic tool just tend to go towards the center of a statistical distribution. Fundamentally, the outputs reflect the inputs, right? And so, when we ask the question, why are these images of people so, white male dominated? Well, because these images were produced by a society that was traditionally white male dominated. And for a lot of society, most men were white doctors in America. So most doctors were white men in America. Small difference. But also, when people portray and represent doctors, often the people doing the portraying and the representation are skewed in their presentation. So we have like a skewed society, and then we have skewed representation, and then most of this stuff is scraped from the internet, and so then we have some weird things about internet culture. Right? Internet culture is not like a perfectly balanced mirror to society, far from it. So you might think, oh, well, that's a software problem. We know how to fix that. We'll just tell the model to be more diverse. We'll just tell the model, when someone asks for a human figure, just mix it up. Just let's have some diversity. Like, we all think diversity is good, right? Google tried this with their recently released Gemini. Gemini is a lot like ChatGPT, like it's a text model, but it also brings in image generation. When you ask for Nazis, Midjourney gives you a racially diverse set of Nazis, which is both historically inaccurate and I think probably in many contexts offensive. When you ask for a pope, I'm not a Catholic, but my understanding is that traditionally popes are men, and I'm not aware that we've had any popes who are non-white. When you ask for a Roman emperor, you get these people. When you ask for a famous physicist of the 17th century, like, there probably should have been black famous physicists in the 17th century, but as a historical fact, it doesn't seem like there were. Now, of course, when Gemini did this, people reacted in a calm, sensible way. They said, well, we can see they had some good intentions, they went a little bit overboard, I'm sure they'll smooth it out. Oh, no, that's not what happened, right? No, people went absolutely crazy. Fox News thought it was a government plot. People started talking about racism against white people. And to be fair, if you asked Gemini, tell me what's good about white people, it would give you a lecture. If you said, tell me what's good about Asian people, it would celebrate your Asianness with you. They did this incredibly badly, right? But this is kind of if you set about to do something in the dumbest possible way, with no subtlety and no nuance, of course things are going to go poorly. There's a deeper problem here, right? There is no truth underlying these models, right? There is no objectively correct, this is what a pope should look like. There's just people's opinions. And people are not going to agree. Some people think it's great that when you ask for a portrayal of someone who's not an actual person who existed, that we inject some diversity. Some people think that that's the end of the world. But the point is, it's not an objective fact. So when we train these models without any ground truth to reference them on, we're not producing anything that is truth producing, right? It's just prediction. It's literally just, given everything we know and what you've told us, this is what we think this drawing would look like. All right. I'm going to switch and talk about a couple of legal issues here. The first one is whether the process of training these AI models is something we should think of as copyright infringement. As I mentioned, we train these models on a huge amount of content scraped from the internet. You can't train it on just a few million works. It doesn't work. You need this incredible scale. The thing about this incredible scale is that you literally can't license it, right? You can't write 1 billion letters, dear sir / madam, would it be okay if I showed my model your picture for half a second so it could move a couple of numbers around in a spreadsheet? Would you mind so terribly? And then wait for the response. That does not scale 1 billion times over, right? So the AI companies just downloaded everything, ran the models, and then argued that it was fair use. And I'm here to tell you that it probably is in many circumstances, right? It depends on a couple of things. It depends on what you think copyright is for, and it also depends on exactly what's going on inside the model. It depends on how much the models are genuinely abstracting rather than memorizing. And that's a fact question that we don't totally know the answer to, but I'll come back to. But yeah, let's talk about what copyright is for. The most fundamental concept in copyright law is the idea-expression distinction. It's the distinction between original expression that is yours as an author and the ideas and facts and information and artistic techniques that are also encoded in that expression. It's perfectly fine to listen to a Taylor Swift song and think, oh, I would also like to write a song about bad poets and their typewriters. Right? That's totally fine. It's perfectly fine to read a Martha Stewart cookbook and actually take the recipe as a set of instructions, retell the recipe in your own words, and sell it in competition with Martha Stewart. Copyright is not about protecting valuable information. It's about protecting expression. That's what I think, anyway. So the idea-expression distinction explains why really bad poetry, like everything you wrote in high school poetry, is copyrightable, even if you just scrolled it down on a napkin. And yet really good ideas are not copyrightable. They're free for public consumption as soon as you release them into the world. Some people think that the purpose of copyright is to prohibit every technical act of reproduction just for its own sake, regardless of the purpose or effect. And if that's your view of copyright, then yeah, all of AI, all of machine learning virtually, is infringement, and there's no way of arguing around it. Other people think that the purpose of copyright is to protect the author's right with respect to their original expression and the way that is communicated to the public. And if that's right, and you can tell I think that's right, if that's right, then non-expressive uses of copyrighted works should generally not be infringing. So if you let's forget about machine learning for a moment. Right? Think about internet search. We have little software agents that go out onto the web, they copy HTML pages, they bring them back to Google, Google builds a search engine index. They may as well then throw those pages away. But that's still copying. They then use that information to tell you that of all the trillions of pages on the internet, when you are looking for the most adorable kittens in Pennsylvania, here are the top 3 sites. Right? They're not actually giving you the sites. You still need to click and go there. They're just giving you information about the sites. Right? That is a non-expressive use that happens all the time and that most people don't get too upset about. Right? There's one of the big legal cases in this area is when Google tried to bring this same philosophy to library books. They were like, we could do internet search, but in printed books. All we need to do is persuade some universities to lend us their books, and we'll scan them, and we'll build a search engine index. Some of America's great universities said, that's an amazing idea, and while we're there, we could do like incredible statistical analysis on all of this knowledge in this field called the digital humanities. So Google got together with the universities, they did this great thing, and of course they got sued by lots and lots of copyright holders. The universities won that lawsuit. That's the HathiTrust lawsuit. HathiTrust is the sort of umbrella organization that the universities were working in. Right? When the universities won that case, the court said, it's actually okay to make these technical copies that sit inside a server that no one's ever going to read, and just to create metadata, create useful information. That's actually advancing the purpose of copyright. It's not holding it back. Google Books said the same thing. So here's the way to think about the copyright issue in generative AI training. It's absolutely true that the first step in building one of these models is just to download a ton of material from the internet. Right? And that is copying. That is technically copying under the Copyright Act. But the model that results from all this copying is not the training data. It's a totally separate thing that, if you do it right, is not a copy of the training data. That's really important, because if the model is not a copy of the training data, then when you query the model, it shouldn't be producing things that are copies of the training data. And if that's true, then the copying that powers generative AI is a non-expressive use, and it should be fair use under American law. Like, I actually think that this is not that controversial. It's politically controversial. There are some authors and artists and Disney Corporation and the Authors Guild, et cetera, who hate this. But in terms of what current US law, what the case law tells us, I don't think this is controversial, like at least in the sort of big picture terms. But the world's not that simple, because it turns out that sometimes these models really do memorize. So this is an exhibit from the lawsuit filed by the New York Times against OpenAI. And the New York Times, in quite a persuasive filing, attached this huge exhibit of, here are 100 examples of essentially word-for-word memorization. Now, I am given to understand that the only way the New York Times could have done this is through trying a massive number of attempts, and that also actually some of these exhibits are cut and pasted from multiple different extraction attacks. Maybe that changes the way we look at that exhibit a little bit. Maybe it changes it a lot. Maybe the knowledge that this is still like a rare event, but you know, they still are able to show a lot of examples. So how much these models actually memorize is just an open factual question that I'm not even sure the people in Silicon Valley really know themselves, but they certainly know more than we do. Why do the models memorize? It's partly because deduplicating the training data is hard, just technically hard, and when you don't deduplicate the training data, you're basically telling the model over and over again, no, the specific order of these words, it's really important. You may as well just memorize it, right? So that's probably the main explanation, and that's what the computer science literature suggests. There's also a weird problem of overfitting, which is when you have this one picture that's accompanied by this totally unique text description that's just not like anything else in the training data. And then again, yeah, the model's just going to memorize it because you haven't really given it a basis to generalize. And then there's also just the fact that these models are really big. Like 1.8 trillion, that's a big, big number. And the larger the model is as a ratio of the training data, the more possible it is for it to memorize. And then there's the question of, well, why are these models so big, right? This is an interesting question. Like, do we really need the model to be that big just to be good at text prediction? Or is the imperative to make the model so large because they really want them to be information retrieval devices, right? You know, that, I think, is a fair question. Again, I don't know the answer. It's kind of a fact question that maybe will come out in this lawsuit. And then there is the Snoopy problem. The Snoopy problem is a term that I'm very proud to say that I coined and has caught on like I never could have imagined. I think it's just because everyone innately loves Snoopy. The Snoopy problem is not anything really about Snoopy. It's about the fact that there are some things in copyright we actually protect really broadly. And copyrightable characters is one of those things. So you can infringe the rights in Snoopy by making an image of Snoopy that no one has ever seen before, that is not actually that much like any specific thing in the training data, but it's still so recognizably Snoopy that we're going to say it's infringement. So I think you all know what Snoopy looks like, and I'm here to tell you that Midjourney and Stable Diffusion definitely know what Snoopy looks like. These Snoopies are not in the training data. They're still copyright infringement, right? It's still at least prima facie a reproduction that infringes on the rights of whoever owns Snoopy these days. So this is the problem. You can deduplicate the training data. You can do everything right, but then you come across these artifacts that we protect really broadly, and those strategies won't work, and you can still use the model to create something infringing. It's not just a problem with Snoopy. It's a problem with books, right? We protect books kind of narrowly in the sense that anyone can write their own wizard book, right? All young wizards overcoming the odds, going to school, learning how to do magic, and ultimately confronting evil stories are kind of the same at an abstract level. J.K. Rowling did not invent this, right? She's not the first one to create such stories, and she won't be the last. So that's fine. But we protect novels in terms of sequel rights really broadly. Basically, any book you want to write that features Harry Potter and Hermione is going to be an infringing sequel of Harry Potter. So things like novels that we protect really broadly, it's actually hard to build a language model that knows anything about our world that can't also be used to write an infringing sequel. I'm not sure that's so much a problem, because I think when that happens, you're almost using the model like a typewriter. Typewriters can also be used to write an infringing sequel, but it's mostly the user who's providing that infringement. I think it's probably the same thing here, but the Snoopy problem is a real problem. Okay, so what's the answer? The answer is there are now 20 lawsuits in various federal courts around the country that are basically posing this question, and we're going to have to wait to find out. Right? Which is not a super satisfactory answer, but that's the way it is. And maybe in Q&A, if people are interested, I can give some more thoughts on what's going to happen in those suits. I want to talk about just another aspect of copyright and generative AI creativity, and that is who owns all of these amazing images that I've been showing you here tonight? Other than Snoopy, Charles Schulz's estate still owns that, right? Should these things be copyrightable? This is a really interesting, super hard question. Let me tell you what the Copyright Office has said. The Copyright Office, and the courts have agreed, have said that when the photographer went to Indonesia and hung out with monkeys for a long time, but could never get them to be close enough to the camera, and so he just left the camera hoping that the monkey would actually take the photo of itself, the Copyright Office said, yeah, I'm sorry, photographer, you did a lot of hard work there, you are not the author of the monkey selfie. The monkey's not the author either, because authorship requires human contemplation that there will be an expressive work. Authorship is all about trying to manifest your expressive intentions into some fixed form, and the monkey didn't know about photography, we assume. So no copyright for the monkey selfie, which means also no copyright for this image, a recent entrance to paradise, that according to the creator of the computer program, was entirely autonomously developed by the computer program. That's actually an easy copyright question. If there's no human involvement at all, right, then there's no authorship. Copyright is for people. But then we get to the tricky case of Zaria of the Dawn. Right? The author of this comic book made all of the images on Midjourney, but she came up with the story, she came up with the dialogue, she came up with the text, and she did a lot of cropping and sequencing. And the Copyright Office, well, actually, initially the Copyright Office registered it because they'd never heard of Midjourney. And then they were like, Midjourney, what? Oh, no, that's not right. So then they took her registration back and they gave her a new one that said, we will register your creativity in the story, in the text, and in the selection and arrangement, but you don't own those individual images because all you did was instruct the computer, and the computer supplied all of the expression. And then finally, we have this case, Theatre d'Opera Spatial, I think, or Spatial Theatre d'Opera by Jason Allen. Mr. Allen produced this image on Midjourney, apparently after 624 prompts. That's a lot of prompts. That's a lot of effort. He then, because he's kind of technical, upscaled the image to basically make it more detailed, and he went in there with Adobe Photoshop and kind of fixed a whole bunch of things and just made it slightly nicer. He then submitted it to the Colorado State Fair. He won a digital art prize. He then said, hey, guess what, everyone? I did this on Midjourney. People got really mad, understandably. But he certainly started an interesting conversation. And then he went to the Copyright Office, and he said, I want a registration for this. And they said, we read the papers. We'll give you a registration for this, but you have to disclaim this, which would basically only protect you against exact duplication of this and not things that just look like this. And he said, no, I want to own the whole thing. I am the author of the whole thing, and I refuse to disclaim, and I refuse to tell you about what my prompts were because they're a trade secret. So you just need to trust me that this image really reflects my detailed vision as an artist and isn't just whatever the computer came up with. And the Copyright Office said, yeah, we don't trust you. We're not going to give you a copyright. And that's where we are with the copyrightability of AI art. Is this right? It's not completely wrong. This is right. There's no copyright in the monkey selfie if really all the photographer did was hand a camera to a monkey, which may not be the full story there either. There's definitely no copyright in this thing, whatever it is, that was supposedly created autonomously by the computer. This one I really am just not sure about, because I think that authorship doesn't have to look the way authorship has always looked. Authorship can be an exploratory process. It can be an iterative process. It can be a process of playing with an object, whether it's a lump of clay, whether it's a computer system, and working with it until you decide, yeah, that is the image that I want. And so think about a photographer who stands in a field watching a bird, waiting for just the right moment to take a photo. That is copyrightable. We would say, well, there's enough creativity and judgment in the selection of when to shoot, how to frame it, etc., that, even though these days cameras do most of the work for you, you get copyright in that. Really, if the same woman stands in the field with her film camera just rolling the whole time and then pulls out just that one frame that she thinks reflects the vision that she was looking for, it's not that different. So I think we need to expand our concept of authorship to actually at least allow for the possibility that sometimes selection and adoption through this sort of incremental process of discovery is enough. The Copyright Office has had a lot of heat for some of these rulings. They're currently sort of looking back at this question. I'm actually pretty confident that they are going to shift in some direction or other. I'm not sure they're going to meet me here, but I think they are going to change that. I've been talking for about an hour now, so I should probably wrap up. I just want to say a couple of things really quickly. Generative AI is going to be disruptive. All amazing new technology is really disruptive, right? That does not mean that it's going to be doomsday, right? It does not mean that there's no role for humans left to play. Right? It does mean there will be winners and losers, right? We need to think about, how do we create a society that is more flexible in the face of disruption, rather than trying to create a society where nothing ever changes. That's my view. Skip over that and just go to this point. We've been here before. We've had disruptive technologies. Technologies like the photograph changed the way we think of art. It led to Impressionism, right? We're actually better off even though there was no longer a thriving market for portrait photography. The spreadsheet was going to doom accountants. Instead, it just liberated them to do higher value work. The jet aeroplane, when you think about it, made pilots much more efficient. We should have needed fewer of them. But because it made flying so much faster, it actually increased the demand for pilots. It's kind of hard to predict in advance what the effects of new technology will be. But historically, even when the losses have been more immediately tangible, the benefits have tended to be greater. And so I had a slide to talk about law, but instead I'm going to skip to your questions. Thank you.
It is now time for the question and answer session. So that everyone in the audience and our speaker can hear your question clearly, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first questions for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. We'll now take the first question.
So I just wanted to ask about where you think AI stands in terms of whether it's more of a tool. So what I'm confused about is, I had the conception that copyright was owned by a person, like a copyright protection. But I mean, I might be wrong. So where does AI stand? Like, who owns that copyright for that tool? And is it more of a tool, or is it like doing more of the work than you are, in which case is it?
Yeah, so first of all, most copyright is owned by large corporations, right? Copyright nominally is about authorship and like acts of isolated creativity, but actually in our society, most copyright is owned by large conglomerates. So here's a picture that I created using DALL-E 3, and I think I asked for a dog made of fluorescent light bulbs of different colors raising its paw to ask a question, right? That's kind of a cute idea. No one owns that idea. Like, ideas are free for everyone. You can now take that idea and do whatever you want with it, right? Even if you think it's a really good idea, even if you think it's original, ideas are not owned by anyone, right? If I had any artistic skill, and I absolutely do not, and I had drawn a particular image of that, then I would own the copyright. But in this particular case, the machine has done all of the work by navigating the latent space and figuring out how to combine sort of the essence of dogliness and the essence of fluorescent light and the sort of the idea of a raised paw, which is incredible. There's no copyright in this image. There's just, I have spun a big wheel and I have created an attractive image, but I haven't done enough to get copyright, in my opinion, even though I think it's a very clever idea, right? And no one else has either, right? And that's fine. We should be okay with the fact that now we're getting like cool digital artifacts that are totally free for everyone to use, right? So that's fine. The issue I have with the sort of Jason Allen case is, these tools are becoming more and more sophisticated. They're becoming more and more controllable, such that I think people are using them in a much more hands-on way, that the product really does reflect their original mental conception, and we should credit them as the author, right? OpenAI still gets no copyright, right? They're just a tool.
Hi there. Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I was curious if you could explain more. You briefly mentioned that one of the models wouldn't generate an image of a Black Lives Matter protester in front of the White House. I was wondering how that works, that the model's able to decline a request like that, and how that could relate to the Snoopy problem.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The answer is it could happen in a number of ways, right? Because that request actually produced a little red bubble error message, I know it's because I tripped one of OpenAI's content filters, right? The people at OpenAI are aware that they've created a very powerful tool, and they're concerned that that kind of tool could be misused. So I think, although, if they knew me and they knew what I was doing here, they would realize, oh, no, that's okay, we can trust him. But I think someone at OpenAI has decided, and it's just a policy, that maybe people are going to use Black Lives Matter as sort of like a politically sensitive, socially sensitive thing. Someone could use this to create a deep fake image of a Black Lives Matter protester doing something bad that they didn't do, and it's going to look realistic, and then it's going to be on Fox News, and people are going to get really angry. And so, we don't want those kind of images. We think that that's a bit too risky. I expect that that's exactly what happened. Right? It's not that they interpret these requests on the fly. I think the way they do it is through this thing called reinforcement learning through human feedback. So once they train the model, they then actually say, great, we've got a model, now we're going to train it some more. We're going to train it on this new data set, which is we're going to let people, our trusted people, we're going to let them ask some questions to the model. We're going to make the model give them a few different responses, and we're going to tell the model what was a good response and what was a bad response. And that's another layer of subjectivity, of human judgment that gets baked into the model. I got to play with GPT-3 before ChatGPT, and if you said, write a poem about a boat, it would often say, write a poem about an aeroplane, write a poem about a dog, right? Its idea of predicting the next word was sometimes a little bit unhelpful. It would be really weird in fun and interesting ways. So through this reinforcement learning, they have managed to kind of push the model in a direction where it's generally considered to be a bit more helpful. But if you've ever asked ChatGPT a question, and it's sort of given you a, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, more research is needed kind of answer, that's all from the reinforcement learning. It's basically, to make the model sound more reasonable, they really pushed it hard to try and sort of, talk about both sides of an issue, to say more research is needed, even some things that there isn't more research needed, right? So these are I don't think this is an Orwellian conspiracy. I think this is when you're releasing a product to the public, you want to make it something the public is going to be happy with and something that people can't easily misuse. I just think Google did a really bad job of it. And they probably were way too aggressive about it. But yeah, so that's, that's a really long answer to your question of why is it like that? But the second part of your question is about the Snoopy problem. Yeah, we could solve the Snoopy problem. And I could never get OpenAI's model to produce Snoopy, right? It would always be here's a beagle. I'd be no, I don't want a beagle. I want Snoopy, right? I want a beagle, who's a World War II pilot. And they're how about you just have a beagle, right? They clearly had installed filters because they'd heard of Snoopy. It's hard to think of everything you'd need an output filter for or a prompt filter for in advance. But, some companies have done more, some companies have done less. I think companies should err on the side of doing a bit more at least while we're in this early phase. I also think that for people who are going to build open source models, they need to do a little bit more about kind of working with the training data to make sure it doesn't learn things you don't want it to know in the first place. Because it turns out it's really hard to train information out of the model. It's much easier just not to train it in the first place.
Thanks a lot. You talked about the many cases going on, and we'll have some greater clarity when some of those cases work their way through the courts about the current state of law. Do you think there's an actual need for new law? If Congress ever functions again, should they do something? Or more likely, should the EU take a lead, as they tend to on digital services, things like that, and like be the first mover on a new form of copyright law for the age of generative AI?
Yeah. So my answer for America is whether Congress should act kind of depends on what the courts do. And I think, as I said to someone earlier, like Congress never misses a chance to throw hard questions to the courts and duck responsibility. I don't see Congress legislating on this issue before we get a court decision. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure. Good news is that in 2019, Europe already acted. So in the Digital Single Market Directive, the European Union created one exemption for academic text mining that's actually really broad, in some cases broader than what US law would allow. And they created a narrower exception for every other kind of text data mining. And the key limitation there is you need lawful access to the materials and you need to comply with opt-outs. So actually in Europe, it's a slightly more restrictive regime, but if we stop building these AI models here, under current conditions, you could just take that business to Europe, or Japan, or Israel, or Singapore, or South Korea. Like, other countries, ironically following America's lead, have liberalized their copyright law to allow for this kind of thing. The Europeans possibly regret it because they had no idea that generative AI was going to happen. They thought they were enabling sort of academic text mining and large-scale data analysis. But they did it, and now we have Mistral, which is a French large language model. I think it's going to be hard for them to take it back. If these cases, the class action cases are going to take forever, because that's the nature of class action. The key cases are the ones brought by people like Getty Images and the New York Times. They're still not going to be super quick. If the plaintiffs win these cases, which they absolutely could, based on there's just too much memorization, right? Then I think those will be narrow wins that'll be bad for the individual defendants, but is not really going to shift the industry. If the defendants win in kind of like a clean sweep, then I think it's, everyone's just going to keep on doing what they're doing. But I do want to point out is like, while people are waiting for the cases to settle, you can already see companies moving to an approach that's more compliant with the EU. So actually trying to figure out how is opt-out actually going to work, right? Trying to figure out how do we avoid training on pirated works because people get really mad about that. And also what you see is companies doing licensing deals, right? They're mostly paying for easy access and fresh data. And that, I think, could lead us to like a healthy ecosystem where people can generally build these models, but still pay for current information, pay for easy access, and actually have like a functioning ecosystem where, journalism is not dead, SourceForge and Stack Overflow, which are websites that programmers go to answer questions, that those things still exist. So I actually think we're heading towards a more healthy equilibrium. And I kind of hope the courts don't mess it up, but we'll see.
We have time for 2 more questions.
I'll try and keep my answers shorter.
Thank you for your talk tonight. It was very interesting. A few years ago, I read a book, and I'm not sure it was a good idea, but it was a book called The Singularity is Near. And it was by a guy named Ray Kurzweil, who you know. And the singularity in this case referred to the point in time when computers are more intelligent than humans. And at the time when computers can program themselves. So, as any futurist, you know, he's predicting specific dates and things like that. I don't buy into that, but I do buy into directionally what he's talking about. So my question is the legal profession thinking far enough ahead to handle that type of technological power?
No.
What I'm very interested. I'm very interested in tonight was you know how you're handling and what you know is here now.
Yeah, I guess I have to say a couple of things. I'm incredibly skeptical that we're anywhere near AGI, and I'm very skeptical that just building larger and larger text prediction models is ever going to get us there. I am super impressed by the increase in reasoning ability from GPT-3 to 3.5 to 4. But I actually think my speculation is that we're going to tap out on just what you can get from scale. And that's partly because we're going to tap out on training data. I don't believe we're headed for AGI in the next 5 years. I do think that a lot of the things that people who are interested in existential risk are worried about are totally things we should be worried about and guarding against nonetheless. Like, we should definitely be working to make sure that these models won't teach you how to create a bomb. That's kind of good, whether it's people using the models to do bad things or the model suddenly waking up and realizing, I don't want to just do what I'm told. I have my own agenda. The conceptual problem with the kind of doomsday scenario is that it imagines huge leaps in capability without any change in objectives. Right? Why would a computer system that's so capable and so smart still just want to make paper clips? Right? It's not, like, that doesn't make sense to me. So, you know, if Skynet comes and enslaves us all next week, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I don't see it. But we're all just making predictions. I'm basically saying what we've done so far is like over here, we would need to get to here, and I don't think that these current trends really extrapolate. Partly for some of the reasons I've spoken about, actually, about understanding the limitations of these models. But like, Google invented the transformer architecture, which is a clever way of programming that I'm not going to go into the details of, that really just made these models much better at the learning and understanding context in 2017. And in 2022, we had ChatGPT. Like, someone might invent some new technique that creates a whole new world of possibilities. And so I'm not going to say, oh, it could never happen, right? I don't know that. But, like, one reason I like law is that it's a practical discipline. So what I say to to my occasional students who are worried about existential risk and people out there in the programming community who are genuinely worried about this is, like, it doesn't matter if you're right or I'm right, most of the things you want to do are just good things that we should do. We should research into how to make sure models don't have a talent for deception, how they're not power-seeking, how they stay aligned to human values. So, you know, like, I don't agree with the alarm, but I'm willing to go along for the ride for that part. I'm sorry, that was not a short answer.
Thank you for your talk. I'm one of those people who are scared for their jobs. I'm a computer science major, and my brother and I often have these talks about will ChatGPT and others replace us. But I was wondering, you talked about the disruptive moment in history that chatbots may provide. How do you see, well, the introduction of the camera, for example, created the photography, art. What do you think chatbots will introduce to our world?
Oh my goodness.
How
I think,
will
yeah, I
the role
think
come into play?
the way we're thinking about generative AI right now is going to seem so quaint in 5 years' time. I think, you know, this is great, this is fun, it enables me to do a more engaging presentation. I think that what we're going to see is things that are much more adaptive personal assistants, things that really actually help us engage with the world, not just make pretty pictures, not just help us rewrite a more polite email, right? I think we're going to see these things integrated with our other productivity tools, so you can be standing at your desk, you should all be standing at your desks, right? Dictating into your computer, and it's kind of like having a conversation with the computer, and you're like, I need an essay on why copyright law is terrible. I think I want to start from a historical perspective, you know, like, show me a standard structure. Yeah, no, I don't like that one, maybe this one. I really, you know, here's what I'm thinking. Like, just flesh that out into a paragraph. Here we go. Like, this is near-term technology. Right? I think you're going to walk into your doctor's office, and an AI is going to take notes in the background. You're going to have a conversation with your doctor, and your doctor, who currently spends 1 hour doing paperwork for almost every hour in the clinic, is going to be able to review those notes and be like, yeah, actually, that's pretty much right most of the time, and then move on to doing the rewarding and engaging part of her job, right? That's the kind of thing that's coming. There are challenges here. How do we stop our doctors from getting a little bit sleepy, getting a little bit complacent, not looking out for the occasional errors, right? You know, we have whole fields of systems engineering that actually like look at these kind of problems in other contexts. We need to bring that knowledge in. We need to think, you know, we need to understand that humans are still humans, and we can't expect them to pay attention and yet make them bored at the same time, right? But the possibilities here are amazing, right? I have a colleague at Emory who has figured out a way to do a lab test basically on a cell phone for $1 that used to cost $5,000, all through machine learning, right? You know, it's things like this that are going to change people's lives much for the better. What I'm worried about is that not that we're not going to need programmers anymore, but that it's going to be harder to get a job as an entry-level programmer, right? And but I also think you're going to be a little bit like the jet airline pilot, right? You're going to be like, oh, I feel like I don't need to hire a whole team of programmers to do this thing. I can just hire one person. Yeah, I'm going to get that service now. So, you know, like, change is hard, change is messy, change can be upsetting, but, you know, like, this seems like such a fabulous school. I'm sure you've had a fabulous education. I am totally optimistic for you.
Tonight's presentation. Thank you so much for coming. And please join me in thanking again Professor Sag.